Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's webinar. Tonight's title, Saying No to Indian Point Radioactive Wastewater Discharges into the Hudson River. We're glad you could be with us this evening. Next slide. So my name's Rebecca Martin. I'm the Director of the Community Partnership Program at Riverkeeper, and I'll be facilitating this evening. The presentation that you're seeing this evening is being recorded. We'll stop recording during the question and answer segment that will occur at the very end, and we'll provide guidance for question and answers from the audience at that time. Next slide. So Riverkeeper's mission. Riverkeeper protects and restores the Hudson River from source to sea and safeguards drinking water supplies through advocacy rooted in community partnerships, science, and the law. You can support us to do more of this important work and become a member by contacting Monica Dietrich, and her email is here, and you can learn how you can join us in our work. Following the presentation tonight, we're going to be sending materials that hopefully will include this recording of tonight's webinar. Otherwise, it'll be uploaded as soon as possible, and materials from this evening's presentations. So the agenda, next slide. So we've got a lot to move through this evening during tonight's 60-minute webinar with a series of presentations, and I'll introduce the panelists shortly. We're joined tonight by Assemblymember Dana Levenberg, and unfortunately, Senator Harcum is under the weather and was not able to join us. However, we're pleased that Brian Pugh, his chief of staff, is in the audience tonight. So thank you, Brian, for being here, and we wish a speedy recovery to the senator. So our presentations will speak with Assemblymember Dana Levenberg, and followed by a take action, a Riverkeeper's recent action on the radioactive wastewater discharges, followed by a Q&A. And you'll see right now at the bottom of your screen a Q&A option where you can start putting your questions in, and we'll get to them at the end. All right, next slide. So I'm happy tonight to present and introduce Richard Webster, who's Riverkeeper's representative on the Decommissioning Oversight Board, the DOB. Richard, do you want to come on camera? So Richard Webster is an attorney with over 20 years of experience in environmental litigation, in addition to 10 years experience as an environmental consultant and expert. He has represented numerous environmental groups and municipalities on a wide variety of issues. He is also Riverkeeper's representative on New York's Decommissioning Oversight Board that oversees the decommissioning of Indian Point. Until last year, Richard was the legal director for Riverkeeper and now serves as outside counsel. Before joining Riverkeeper, he litigated an aging management issue in the relicensing of the Oyster Creek nuclear power plant, an environmental justice issue in the Indian Point relicensing, and multiple issues in an initial licensing for the Levy nuclear power plant in Florida. Before becoming an attorney, Richard was an expert hydrologist and environmental scientist. Richard received his JD in 2002 from Columbia Law School. Long before that, he earned a master's degree from London University in engineering hydrology and a BA in physics, and from Oxford University in England. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Richard. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. So very pleased to be here. The goal tonight is to kind of say a little bit of where we've come from on Indian Point, and then say where we're going, and then zoom in a little bit on the tritium issue. So Rebecca, can you give me the next slide? So yeah, keep going. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about why Riverkeeper campaigned to close Indian Point. The genesis was cooling water discharges. We had a campaign called Power Plants That Suck. Indian Point actually was supposed to be what was called a closed cycle cooling plant. And then at the last minute, they switched it to what's called a once-through cooling plant. And so there are huge volumes of river water being sucked in. And along with those huge volumes of water were large amounts of organisms, small fish, larvae, and so forth. And those were killed by going through the plant. In addition, there was a thermally hot discharge that came into the river and disturbed the ecosystem. So that's where we started. And then sort of on that core, we had concerns about radioactive contamination. There were groundwater discharges into the river. The groundwater had leaked from the fuel pools, both Indian Point 1 and Indian Point 2 fuel pools. And there were also ongoing tritium discharges. So those are the water pollution concerns. But then we had, as sort of the more we looked at Indian Point, the worse it got, really. There was a risk of accident, high risk of accident. Earthquakes were a problem, newly discovered faults. Poor maintenance was a problem. There were problems with these things called O-rings that seal the reactor at the top. Baffle bolts that kind of hold the reactor together. There was a spent fuel pool. The fuel had been packed in so tight that there was a danger of a fuel pool accident. And there was co-location of gas pipelines. All of these things can give rise to an accident. Obviously, an accident at Indian Point is particularly severe because it's close to New York City. So on the consequence side of the accident, we had a huge population in the area, and then we had a failed evacuation plan. There was a study called the WIT study many years ago that really showed that the paper evacuation plan wouldn't work. And so we also actually, with the Clearwater, I worked with Clearwater on the evacuation plan, and we also showed that there was an environmental justice issue because, of course, generally people who have less access to cars have more trouble evacuating, and particularly when the evacuation relies on, open air bus stops where you're supposed to stand at the bus stop and wait for the magic evacuation bus to pick you up. And the worst case possible actually was the Sing Sing prison, where there was really no plan on how to get the prisoners out there, or at least no plan that had anything close to working. So Indian Point, pollution issues were where we started, but then we got into all these accident issues and the consequences of accident issues. So we campaigned for many years to close the plant. Next slide, Rebecca. So how did it happen? Well, basically the state, Riverkeeper and Entergy agreed in January 2017 to close Indian Point in 2020 and 2021. I think that's units 2 and unit 3 respectively. Why those three? Well, those are the parties that were in the proceedings at the NRC regarding license renewal and in the proceedings at the state regarding the cooling water discharges. The agreement was a settlement basically of those proceedings. And so you needed all the parties to the settlement, all the parties to the proceedings to agree a settlement. So that's why Riverkeeper was in there with the state and Entergy. Why did it happen? Well, I think we can say Entergy's decision was precipitated by various state actions and economic factors as well. So it was kind of everything came together at the right time. Gas was cheap, so the competition was strong, and the state really worked hard in the cooling water proceeding and in a couple other proceedings to make relicensing difficult. In particular, the state was very active in the relicensing proceeding, and although I always say no one ever wins at the NRC, the state managed to not lose for a long time. So that was put effective pressure. But why was the state trying to close Indian Point? Well, the answer is because of public pressure. I strongly believe that the state would not have chosen to put such pressure on Indian Point had the state itself not been under pressure from groups like Riverkeeper, Clearwater, IPSC, and many others. I mean, I won't name everybody, but it takes a village to do these things, and there's a lot of support from all around Westchester County for the closure, and that really got the attention of the state. Further illustrating that the state didn't really have any ideological problem with nuclear plants. The upstate nukes got bailouts at the same time as Indian Point was closed. So I think it shows you that the public pressure was dispositive in getting this plant to close. And Riverkeeper, we were very pleased and happy to be part of the coalition of groups that that precipitated the closure. Next slide. So with every success comes some problems, and this is no exception. Here, once the closure agreement was in place, we faced the problem that Entergy had the right under NRC rules to delay decommissioning until 60 years after closure under a program called Safe Store. So that was the first problem. We really didn't want the plant, the plant site to be left in a contaminated state for 60 years. We wanted a fast cleanup. The problem is Entergy selected Holtec as its decommissioning specialist. And I think, as we said at the time, Holtec has a track record of bribes, lies, and risk-taking. So that wasn't good. NRC, as I think most of you know, is captured by the industry and is not responsive at all to public pressure. So the NRC basically nearly always rules for the industry, and is actually impervious not only to public pressure, but it's pretty much impervious to political pressure because of the way it's funded, which is it's 90% funded by the industry. And it's an independent federal agency, which means it doesn't directly answer to Congress. There are some oversight committees in the Senate, but again, the senators on those oversight committees have generally pretty close ties with the nuclear industry. I always said that if the industry ran its reactors as well as they ran their lobbying campaigns, I would not be so worried. There was no full-time NRC inspector on site, so during decommissioning, there is no full-time NRC inspector. And then the NRC citizen advisory boards are generally run by the licensee. They are largely serve as for the licensee to tell people how well things are going. There's this issue called preemption, which is that state jurisdiction over nuclear plants is quite narrow. The federal law specifically says that all nuclear safety issues are reserved for the NRC. And a number of state laws have been struck down on that basis. In particular, one in Vermont about relicensing was struck down because legislators said repeatedly that it's about nuclear safety. And so if you say that and you pass some legislation, if it's about nuclear safety, it's preempted. That's the federal government, the NRC's exclusive jurisdiction. And then finally, there were some issues. You know, there was a $15 million community fund. Of course, the question then came, who's going to get the $15 million community fund? And to cut to the chase, eventually it was split between the towns, Buchanan, Portland, and a project that Riverkeeper favored, which was long-term monitoring of the biological state of the river, which had been funded by Entergy while the plant was open and was facing a lack of funding when the plant closed. So we managed to get that issue resolved. But I want to emphasize that Riverkeeper itself did not get a dime of the $15 million. In fact, during the settlement, I believe we were offered some fees and we didn't take them because we didn't think that was the right thing to do. So if you hear rumors to the contrary, give me a call. I'll let you know the full details. Next slide. So those are the problems. So the question is, what about opportunities? How could we work the problems around into opportunities? So first of all, Holtec promised to get the decommissioning done in 15 years and to get the fuel out of the fuel pools very quickly. And for those that know anything about Indian Point or nuclear reactors in general, the reactor itself is the highest risk operation on the site, but the fuel pools are still a big risk. The chance of them having an accident is fairly low, but the consequence of having an accident is extremely high. I mean, when I say extremely high, I did some calculations for Oyster Creek and discovered that basically a spent fuel pool fire at Oyster Creek would have contaminated about half of New Jersey. And that's contaminated for a long time, made it uninhabitable. So the spent fuel pool fire is extremely consequential, and Holtec was offering to get the fuel out of the pools very quickly. We decided overall that we were not going to get any joy. We'd spent quite a lot. I've spent quite a bit of time fighting at the NRC through adjudicative proceedings and other methods, and have had very little to show for it. Formally, sometimes you get some useful information that you can then feed forward into other campaigns. But we decided, instead of putting our eggs in the NRC basket, we would largely put our eggs in the state basket. And so a coalition, including Riverkeeper, sought greater state oversight, basically through the DOB. Happily, our legislators at the time, Pete Harkham and Sandy Galef, were very receptive to this idea and proposed legislation to achieve a DOB. The Public Service Commission asserted jurisdiction of the license transfer. Jurisdiction was not a given. We had to work on that for quite a while, and again, with the help of our legislators, we got the Public Service Commission the legal right to assert jurisdiction, and then they did assert jurisdiction. The PSC then convened a settlement process with all the parties in the PSC proceeding, which included Riverkeeper, and after many hours of Zoom calls during the pandemic, we managed to agree what's called the joint proposal, which basically sets out a number of very useful things that Holtec has to meet, and importantly, puts these things in the state jurisdiction rather than the federal jurisdiction. So the JP, I won't go through the whole thing, but it provides important financial guarantees. It provides DEC supervision of the cleanup. It provides for some funding of emergency management, emergency planning, etc. So the JP, you know, you can focus on what's not in it, but you have to realize that there's a lot of things that are in it. This is probably the best deal that anybody's had on decommissioning in the country. And so I think it was a very important step and a very useful step. We wouldn't have agreed to that settlement unless we thought it was substantive and that it would put us in a better position than not having a settlement. And then the governor, actually what happened was that our legislators were pushing legislation, but the governor short-circuited the legislation by agreeing to set up the Decommissioning Oversight Board, which is what we have. And I should say, again, the Decommissioning Oversight Board, this is something that originated with a few other groups that we came on board and took it up with them. It's pretty clearly the best oversight board in the country for decommissioning. And I think so far it's played a useful role. We've actually achieved some useful things on certain issues, such as weight limits over the pipeline, for example. And it's also served a very useful transparency function. And of course, it gives us a chance to hold Holtec's feet to the fire a little bit in front of a public audience, which I think acts as good discipline for them. And then finally, DPS, the Department of Public Service, has provided a full-time state inspector who is on site to supervise the decommissioning. So overall, I think with decommissioning, we had there's a lot of issues. It's a tough, the NRC deliberately sets it up to be tough to work on. And I think we did a pretty good job overall, although of course, since I was involved, it's kind of, I shouldn't really say this, but I think overall, comparing with, at least let me put it this way, other activists from other states asked me, how did you guys get that? Because that's a really good deal. And the answer is, we got it, again, through a broad coalition of public pressure, which then made our legislators sit up and take notice that our legislators were responsive. And then because our legislators were responsive, ultimately the state was responsive. So it's a chain coming from the bottom, public pressure pushing upwards through environmental groups to get to the state. Rebecca, next slide. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of the theme, I guess, of the presentation. Two themes, I think. One is public pressure gets us somewhere. Two is you can't always get what you want, but can we get what we need is the question. So the gas pipeline remains, much to the chagrin of many, but there are protocols in place, as I said, to prevent rupture due to heavy equipment. There's a school on the edge of the site, but there is robust radiological monitoring in place, and it will be augmented. Emergency response is in place until the spent fuel pools are empty. However, that's the good news, or the semi-good news. The bad news is Holtec keeps pushing for exemptions. Holtec, I should recognize, isn't unusual in this. They basically have a playbook that the NRC's provided that says, you know, when you get to this stage, apply for this exemption. When you get to that stage, apply for that exemption. And they're just basically going through and doing what the NRC told them to do. But nonetheless, it isn't good for us. The dry casks for spent fuel. So when the fuel comes out of the spent fuel pool, it goes into dry casks. Those dry casks are vulnerable to terrorist attack because they're currently exposed. You can see them from the river. And the aging management is inadequate. In other words, the inspections that they will do to make sure that there isn't any decay of the canisters inside the casks really are cursory, and I won't go into the details, but believe me, there's a lot of work to do on that. We have radioactive groundwater continues to leak from the site. And then finally, we have what you've all been wondering when I'm going to get to, which is there are tritium discharges proposed in what's a business as usual approach. You know, Entity was doing this before. Holtec has come along and said, okay, we'll just keep doing the same thing. So that's where we were. Next slide, Rebecca. All right, so why did this tritium issue come up? And I think it came up, and I could be wrong, but at least one factor was that citizen pressure in Massachusetts led the NRC to basically use the NIPD's permit, the Clean Water Act permit, to prevent discharge of tritium into the bay in Cape Cod at Pilgrim. And that continues to be an ongoing debate there. But I think, you know, people saw, well, wait a minute, if they're afraid of tritium pollution in Cape Cod, we should be afraid of it here. Now, the slight difference is that Entity had discharged this tritium, this radioactive water, for 50 years while the plant was operational. And just so you know why it's only tritium, or basically only tritium, it's because the treatment plant that they have reduces the other radionuclides through a series of filters to a very low level. So it's nearly all tritium. So I think the Cape Cod scenario showed us that these discharges could be stopped with appropriate citizen pressure. And of course, that's not something we succeeded on for a long time. I mean, we succeeded in closing the plant. So to that extent, we'd stopped ongoing tritium discharges, but we hadn't been able to stop the discharges while the plant was operational. So the campaign to prevent tritium discharge was led by grassroots groups, and we came on board with that campaign. And it prompted us to evaluate the issue very carefully. We listened to everybody. And next slide, Rebecca, we'll see what we came up with. Okay, so we basically listened to everybody, and I'll tell you our position in a bit, but I just want to, before I do that, just highlight what tritium is and why it's a problem in some ways, and why it's kind of, there's no very easy way to deal with it. So tritium is basically water, which you remember is H2O from your high school chemistry, but there's 2 extra neutrons in the nucleus of one of the hydrogen atoms. Right, so basically what that means is the electrons are the same, but the nucleus is different. So chemically, it's exactly the same as water. You know, it behaves in the body just the same as water. It goes into the body, it'll be absorbed by the body, etc. The only way to separate it is by weight, because obviously with two neutrons, you've got a proton and two neutrons is a lot heavier than just one proton. So the weight difference is quite substantial. The nucleus is unstable. This is what gives rise to radioactivity. So when the nucleus splits apart, it emits an electron, and so it's called a beta emitter. Basically, beta just means beta particle is an electron. It just is another word for it. The half-life is about 12 years. So that means, what does that mean? That means that, you know, if you start with an activity of 10 curies, then after 12 years, it'll be 5 curies. After another 12 years, it'll be 2.5 curies, etc. You keep going down. And it never quite, you know, just to emphasize the point, it goes down as an exponential curve. It asymptotically goes to 0, but it never actually hits 0. If the tritium is in your body when it emits an electron, that can cause genetic damage. Obviously, you should avoid ingestion of tritium. While there is an EPA drinking water standard, that isn't based on health issues, so there is no good health-based standard. And I think there's a concern about bathers and organisms in the water. We haven't got evidence showing it's bad, or we haven't got evidence showing it's harmful at the levels it will be discharged at, but likewise, the industry doesn't have levels saying it's not harmful. So we have an unknown here, and basically we're taking the precautionary approach and saying, let's be precautionary. If we can avoid this discharge, we should. Next slide, Rebecca. All right. Tritium, who regulates it? Well, the answer is NRC. Does the Clean Water Act regulate it? Answer, no. There's a Supreme Court case that says that. The NRC, as I've said, is not going to stop the discharge. Therefore, we need to mirror what we did before and go to the state. The state could use a chemical that's in the spent fuel pool called boron. If it prevented that discharge from the spent fuel pool, then that would also prevent the tritium discharge. That is what EPA did at Cape Cod. I say they might be able to do it because there'll probably be some legal challenges if they did, but that is a possibility. And then I think the best chance of stopping this discharge is state legislation, which Pete Harkeman and Dana Levenberg have happily proposed. And we're supporting that legislation. We're hoping it will get passed. But just a word of warning, to avoid preemption, we have to be careful not to venture into nuclear safety, but stick to economic and health issues. So it's not, to be clear, it's not about preventing an accident. It's about economic issues. If people think there's tritium in the Hudson, they may be less likely to buy houses, use it for swimming, etc. Next slide, please. All right, so this is Riverkeeper's position. If we can avoid the tritium discharge, we should. There are two options which haven't been explored to any great extent yet, which is solidification and separation by weight. So we think the best approach will be to store the tanks, store the tritiated water in tanks for 12 years while we evaluate the options. And why 12 years? Two reasons. One is because it's a half-life, so at minimum we know we'll have half the problem in 12 years. And the other is because that'll be just towards the end of the decommissioning, so it won't impede site reuse. We'd also like the groundwater discharges to be stopped. That groundwater is unfiltered. It came out of the fuel pool, I think Unit 2, mostly, and Unit 1 and Unit 2, and it contains heavier elements such as strontium and cobalt, and the strontium does bioaccumulate to your bones. So that's nasty stuff. We would like those discharges to be stopped. And then we'd like everybody to support the Harkeman Levenberg bill. we have to get quick action on this. Holtec said at the last DOB meeting they want to discharge in August, and they might even discharge before that. So we need to get this done quickly, and I think the proposed bill is the best way of doing that. So I think that's it, Rebecca. Next slide. Yes.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks to everybody for attending. And just to reiterate, we're banking questions right now. If you look at the bottom right-hand side of your screen in the menu bar, there's a Q&A function, and you can add your questions there, and we'll get to them at the end. But next, I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Michel Lee. If you could come on camera, Michel. Hi there. Great. So Michel is an attorney by training and works in a pro bono advocacy capacity with a number of environmental groups in New York, and serves on the board of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, an industry watchdog organization based in the Washington, D.C. area. She's a member of the Nuclear Consulting Group, an international interdisciplinary, think tank, which focuses on a wide variety of issues which intersect with nuclear matters, including public health, safety, and security. Welcome, Michel.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Okay, it's getting late, so let's dig in. So when I was thinking about this issue, it really occurred to me, why does it matter? There are so many different environmental issues you can fight against. And this is what I think really is the organizing principles, at least for me. So why does it matter? It matters because a clean river is a right. It matters because dilution is not the solution to pollution. And it matters because our beautiful Hudson River and local communities have been dumped on enough. So let me, first of all, emphasize the first point. This is a rights-based argument. So we can quibble like all day about levels of toxicity and how much harms who or what, but at a certain level, it's beyond the point. It's besides the point. Context is also relevant here. Holtec took over Indian Point, and it took over a $2.4 billion decommissioning trust fund that was paid into by New York ratepayers. The money that was left over from decommissioning and cleanup was supposed to go back to New Yorkers. But when Holtec took it over, and with the okay of the NRC, the business model of Holtec is to do as, frankly, fast and cheap and arguably dirty a decommissioning as possible and pocket whatever is left over. So that's their profit model, being able to have money from that fund left over. And where there is a difference between all the radionuclides that went into the river while Indian Point was operating and now is that there's no public benefit to having more radionuclides and other contaminants dumped into the Hudson River, right? You could at least make an arguable claim that while the plant was operating, there was no other option. Nuclear plants that operate have to be releasing radioactivity continually into the air, into the water, into the soil. That's part of the operation. But you can say, well, at least we get power from it. Whereas that's not the case with a shut plant. So when you're looking at cost benefit, all the cost would be borne by New Yorkers and of course our river, and all the benefit of dumping it into the river would go to Holtec. And basically from a public policy perspective, I think that's a very raw deal for New Yorkers. So can we go to the slide with the, okay, so this is interesting. When you're thinking about the river, and when you're thinking about adding more detrimental impacts into it, you really have to understand that a liver is it's a living ecosystem, right? So this is actually a river. It was originally done by Riverkeeper. It's a thermal photo of the heat plume at the top that was emitted by Indian Point into the river while the plant was operating. And at the bottom plume on the left was a shut coal plant. But you can see that just the heat alone as it impacted this river tremendously. And that was actually one of the contentions New York filed when it went to a battle against against the relicensing of the plant. One of the problems in this whole area is that the contamination itself is invisible, right? So there are very few visuals that you have. That's one reason I wanted to show this. I'll have another one later, unless it's up to the next slide. I'm not sure where you, Rebecca, okay, we'll save the other one for later. But the whole issue of dilution being the solution to pollution drives me absolutely nuts. Because the premise is basically, okay, we can incrementally poison the river, as long as we do it in little bits and then it washes all over and it just vanishes. Well, that doesn't happen with many of the radionuclides. Many of these radionuclides, not tritium, with the tritium, it has a half-life of 12 years, which means it has a full radioactivity life of about over a century. But there are many other radionuclides that would be that have been and potentially would be added in this wastewater. We don't know what they are yet because they haven't been characterized. But when you think of the overall health of the river and the idea of dilution being the solution, right? So that's why we have Hudson that's choking with microplastics. It's why we have rivers awash with PFAS. And it's why the Hudson River is a 200-mile Superfund site. Because over the years, decades ago, when General Electric was putting in its, throwing PCBs into the river, everybody just thought, oh, the volume of water is just going to dilute it. It's no big deal, right? So this, going back to with the release we're talking about today, this is an opportunity to stop and to fight against a release that is irreparable. You can't take it back. Once the tritium and the other radionuclides are released into the river, that's it. It's a done deal. So that's why I think this is actually a good place to draw a line in the sand and basically say no. So first, next slide. I'm going to go through this slide really fast and just point out a couple of things. So these are just 4 studies that are fairly recent, talking about the issue of radionuclides in water. So the first one was Rapina, was a Woods Hole study that was done last year for the Pilgrim community, who are up in arms about, or actually from the Plymouth community that in Massachusetts, that is up in arms about the release of contaminated water into Cape Cod Bay. So basically, this study basically just estimated where the currents would go and the tides based on wind, and it went through 30 years of data. And basically said, some of it's going to enter Cape Cod Bay. So obviously this is something that the community there, fishermen and so forth, are strongly objecting to. The second one I just thought was fascinating. This was a study done some years ago, and they were trying to compare or identify where radionuclides were in the Hudson River from different sources. Because there is a Knoll's Atomic Power Laboratory that was on the Mohawk River that actually emptied into the Hudson. So they were able to trace some of the radionuclides from the corals. But when they looked also at the radionuclides from Indian Point, and they were only looking at cesium-137, one of the things they found was this cesium-137 in the sediments 18 miles downstream of Indian Point's location. So that just really illustrates what should be an obvious fact, which is the water in this river. It's a tidal estuary. It goes up, it goes down. And you really don't know exactly where the radionuclides are going to end up. But as was found by the Rapina study, there's a reasonable assumption it's going to be going near the shoreline and possibly aggregating in organically bound tritium in sediment by the shore where people recreate and fish and swim and so forth. I'll skip over Bonadera right now just for time. Makajani, one thing that's sort of funky about tritium is it has exceptionally high molecular exchange rate with hydrogen atoms. And so that makes it very mobile in the environment. And it disperses in this really weird way where this is unique to tritium, where atoms that aren't radioactive can become radioactive based on their proximity to the tritium molecules. So this is a study that came out, actually it's a monograph that came out earlier this year by Arjun Makajani, who's a chemist who's done a lot of study of radionuclides over the years. And he notes that for a given mass, tritium is about 150,000 times as radioactive in terms of disintegration as plutonium, which is an extremely toxic radionuclide. And this is something I didn't know until I read his monograph, is a teaspoon of tritiated water as H2O, which is one of the forms tritium can take, would contaminate about 100 billion gallons of water to the US drinking water limit, which by the way is 20,000 picocuries per liter. So next slide. So National Academies report. This came out last year. Long name as much of these studies are, leveraging advances in modern science to revitalize low-dose radiation research in the United States. So key acknowledgement in this study, which most of us knew, but now it's stated authoritatively for the record, is that the NRC regulations are basically based on 1970s era science. And so let me just give a little bit of background about 1970 era science. It's really based on 1960s and 1950s research. And the entire sort of regulatory scheme globally, but in the United States, is essentially based on what came out of the Manhattan Project when health physics discipline was born. And what was looked at the time, as you would think, understandably from the Manhattan Project scientists that they were thinking of protecting, was they were looking at, how much can you expose a man who is 20 to 30 years old, weighs 154 pounds, is Caucasian. So that obviously doesn't apply to the most vulnerable people that are in our society. And what the National Academies study also noted is that the whole regulatory scheme only looks pretty much at cancer, which of course is absolutely hideous risk of exposure to radiation. And there's that goes under what's called the no threshold standard. It's basically there's no level of radioactivity exposure that couldn't potentially cause cancer. So that standard is pretty well accepted, and we're certainly not going to object to it. But the problem is, as acknowledged by the National Academies, is there are a lot of other diseases and health conditions besides cancer. And many of these actually are more likely to be caused by exposures to low level and low doses of radiation, which is what the US population is more likely to be exposed to, right? So let's just go to the ethics issue. So we're talking about cumulative impacts. And the Peak School area community is an environmental justice community. And that's why the point made before, not only is it enough of radioactivity and other pollutants dumped into the Hudson, but it's really enough dumped on this community. So they have a whole slew of different, it used to be it's an old industrial area. And one of the most really pernicious industries in the area is this wheelabrator. That is an incinerator that burns all of the waste of Westchester County. So that is basically continually being pumped into the air and into the Hudson River. So when you're thinking of what the actual health impacts are in actually human beings and in the aquatic system, you really have to take into consideration the entirety of the burden. So now we have this is actually a NRC visual, and this came out of the leaks, the legacy leaks at Indian Point. Again, you have to be thinking of what the cumulative impacts of radioactivity are, and of all the other chemicals and other toxins that have been pumped into this river from Indian Point and other sites in the area and up and down the river. So this was after they discovered that there were these leaks from the spent fuel pools under the site. This is essentially two different plumes. At the time, it was both tritium and strontium that had been leaking unknown to anybody until it was discovered. And some of the leaks were gone on for years and years from the spent fuel pools, from the Indian Point Unit 1 and Unit 2 spent fuel pools. And those legacy leaks are still going into the Hudson River, and they're going into the groundwater of the area. It should be mentioned also that there are many, many buried pipes at the Indian Point site that carried water that was radioactive. And as these pipes age, and some of them are going to be left after decommissioning, you're likely to have a lot more contamination coming out of these pipes and leaching into the soil and the groundwater and ultimately into the river. So that basically sums up what I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. Now I want to introduce Assemblymember Dana Levenberg, who joins us tonight. We're so pleased that she could be here. Dana's experience as Assemblywoman, Sandy Galoff's Chief of Staff, as well as 9 years on the Ossining School Board, gave her the skills needed for managing staff and taxpayer dollars. During her tenure as Ossining Town Supervisor, Dana focused on building healthy communities, economically, environmentally, physically, and mentally, all through a lens of equity. Dana brings a positive, can-do attitude to her work, along with an instinct for collaboration. She co-founded the Ossining Microfund, as well as the newly formed Open Arms for Refugees, organized in the wake of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Dana also served on a number of boards or advisory boards throughout the region, including Sustainable Westchester, the Sing Sing Prison Museum, the Westchester Municipal Planning Federation, the Westchester Municipal Officials Association, Historic Hudson River Towns, and T-Town. Dana will continue working to make the 95th Assembly District greener, fairer, and more prosperous for all through partnerships and innovative approaches to problem solving. Welcome, Assemblymember Dana Levenberg.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you so much to Riverkeeper, to Richard Webster, and to my partner, Senator Pete Harcum in the state legislature, for this opportunity to speak to you this evening. And again, perfect segue into the idea of partnerships and innovative approaches to problem solving. I think, I jumped into the process and sitting on the DOB, the Decommissioning Oversight Board, basically on January 1st when I took office. I had attended a number of meetings over the course of the last year, and I had been very involved when I was working for Sandy with the working on trying to keep AIM pipeline from being sited where it currently is. Excuse me. So I'm, obviously familiar with the issue. I'm grateful for the new information. I learned a little bit more today, actually, listening to Richard and also to Dr. Lee. Recently, Dr. Lee and I think another partner of yours presented to the Decommissioning Oversight Board. And at the same time, we learned about Holtec's plan to discharge the tritiated water into the Hudson, 1 million gallons, in August. Richard very kindly asked if they could give us at least a month notice, which they agreed to. Of course, we don't really know if that necessarily means anything, but it's been emphasized multiple times that the state doesn't really have anything that we can do about the discharging of radionuclides. So again, partnering with Senator Harcum and with Riverkeeper, we thought we would try on this new approach, since we are legislators, of introducing legislation that would essentially disallow radiated water to be discharged into any New York waterways. And we have introduced that legislation, and we have a bill number. For those of you, I saw a few questions in the Q&A, which is S5181 is the Senate number, A5338. And again, we're very grateful to Riverkeeper for already starting, I think, a huge letter writing campaign. And we've received many letters, as have my colleagues in the state assembly. We have, I think in the assembly, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 assembly members who have already signed on, and we just started actually circulating it when we got the bill number on Friday. Not sure how they're doing in the Senate, but it's certainly of great interest, and it will be going through the Environmental Conservation Committee. So I think what we're hoping tonight is to get everybody to help get support for the legislation and make sure that we get the word out far and wide throughout New York State. I think, again, Dr. Lee kind of said, it's sort of like enough is enough. I mean, why are we going to continue to allow discharging of these types of elements, I guess, into our beautiful Hudson River, or any of our beautiful waterways, whether they provide drinking water to communities, which, by the way, the Hudson does, or not. We know lots of people already have problems from other pollutants in the Hudson, that you can't really eat the fish in the Hudson if you're fishing down here because of the mercury. And, we've been trying to open the beaches. Town supervisor in Austin, we worked very hard to look at trying to open the beach in Austin. What could we do to make sure that the water is cleaner? And, knowing that we're dumping any sort of toxins into the water that would prevent people from using it to swim in, to paddle board, to kayak, to sail, or any other things that people love to do in our beautiful waterways, just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. And while maybe, I don't know if tritium is or isn't cumulative in the body, because I think, I can't remember who discussed that, if that was Richard or Dr. Lee, but if it's part of the sediment of the water that may be washing up 18 miles, up to 18 miles south, where they saw the CS-137. I think we just need to say enough is enough. And at the very least, and this is the least, we need to slow down this discharge until we can find a better plan. I don't know that there's any plan right now that's perfect. At the last meeting of the Decommissioning Oversight Board, we heard from the nuclear expert who is part of the board, who presented to us about basically what they saw were the 4 potential options as part of the decommissioning process. And again, I think it's important to note that Holtec has been hired to close the plant down. So just leaving things as is doesn't necessarily fit into their plan. It doesn't fit into their plan to speed up the process and get out and be done. And and some of our communities don't like it either, for the reason that they want the land back to be put back into service as something else. So all of those are working sort of in different directions as to how we can move forward on this. But I think that for those of us who greatly value the Hudson River and all that it has to offer, I think that we need to work hard to get the legislation passed, to slow the process down, to figure out an alternative that is sensible, that is presents the least harm, and present potentially no harm. That's a possibility. And I'm grateful again to all the partners and all the advocates, and there are many of them who are on tonight and who have participated in our in the hearings for a couple of years now. And again, I think Richard credits the public outcry with actually getting the plant shut down eventually, and helping with lawsuits and helping put pressure on us as well as our federal legislators. And I think that that's another area that we need to continue to pressure, which is to make sure that our federal legislators know how upset everybody is about this potential release, and do whatever we can to slow it down until we can figure out something safer. So again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Assemblymember, for being here. I'm going to invite Jeremy Cherson now to talk about our action. Jeremy is our Senior Manager for Government Affairs at Riverkeeper. Jeremy.
Hi, thank you so much, Rebecca. And I couldn't have said anything better than Assemblywoman Levenberg. So thank you so much for your advocacy and carrying this legislation in the Assembly. And thank Senator Pete Harkin for introducing the bill in the Senate. On the Senate side, I took a quick look, and there are 5 co-sponsors. The bill is even bipartisan, which is excellent for the fate of the legislation. It is so important that everyone on this webinar, and for those of you who are watching after the fact, to go to the link that is posted on this slide and take action that will send a message to legislators and Governor Hochul to support S5181 A5338, which is the legislation that will prohibit the discharges from of radiated water into any waterways in New York State. It is so important for them for legislators in Albany to hear from you. I mean, there's a reason why 18 Assembly members and 5 senators have signed on within just a couple of weeks to this legislation, and it's because of you and the community speaking up and saying how important this legislation is, and getting it passed by both chambers, the Senate and Assembly. They both have their own timeline, their own processes to do so. It's just going to be the first step. Once we get them passed in both houses, we'll call on you all again to convince Governor Hochul of the importance to sign the legislation, so we can then prevent the discharges from Indian Point. So please follow the link to our action and send a message. Today we have guidance on how to do so. and we hope you will. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. That concludes our presentations this evening. We want to thank you all so much for coming to tonight's presentation and webinar. And as we said earlier, we will be sharing this recording. We'll upload it soon and provide all of the participants with the webinar, the presentation deck, and our action alert.